there, my name is Rashmi and this is my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to show you part 2 of how I draw mandalas. In part 1 I had shown you how to make a framework for a mandala and how to make a circle and how to break it down into smaller parts. But today I'm going to show you how to draw a few patterns inside those small parts. So without further ado, I'm going to take you to part 2 of how I draw mandalas. So see you there.
The exercise that we did in part 1 has given us this framework. Now we have 8 different sections made by 8 different concentric circles. And then we have further divided it into 16 parts by making these lines. To start making the patterns, what we are going to do is make these tiny little markings that you see in green on the first circle. Now, this is going to help us make the patterns. Now I'm going to make some petal-like patterns in the second circle from the center point. So to do that, I'm making these tiny little markings that you saw in green in the diagram. So these tiny little markings are made where I'm making these tiny little markings where I think is the center of each tiny little section in circle 1. So basically you're just eyeballing it and placing these tiny little marks with a pencil. It doesn't have to be perfect, you're just going to eyeball it. And now I'm going to use these markings as the starting point for each petal and the ending point for each petal. So this way I'm making sure that each petal has a certain width and some of them don't end up looking fatter than the other. So this whole exercise of marking or making marks with the pencil assures that you end up with a pattern which is uniform and symmetrical. So as you can see, I am starting my petal on the tiny marking that I made on circle number 1 and then taking it to circle 2 and bringing it back to the tiny marking on circle 1. So that way I am making sure that each petal is of the same width. So I'm going to do the same thing with all the other patterns that I'm going to make in every little section, in every little circle. So just bear with me and keep looking where I make the tiny little markings. The markings have to be really light, just dark enough for you to see. Don't make them really, really dark, because then it will look really ugly on the paper. It should be light enough to be easy enough to erase. Now that I've done the patterns in the second circle, I'm going to move ahead. Next, I'm going to target the 4th circle from the center point. So as you can see, I'm making tiny little markings on the 4th circle too, wherever I think is the center. Just eyeball it, doesn't have to be perfect. The beauty of the mandala drawing is that when you look at one single section, you may see certain flaws, but when you see it as one big picture, it looks flawless. So don't worry if your lines aren't that straight or your centers aren't where you think they should be, because at the end it's all going to look pretty. Once I've finished making the little markings on circle 4, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some cone-like shapes. That's going to be my next pattern. So I'm going to make some cone-like shapes that are going to start from the tip of the petal that I drew in circle 2. Then I'm going to take that line to the 4th circle and bring it back to the tip of the petal, the next petal in circle 2. So from the first tip of the petal to circle 4 and coming back to the next tip of the petal in circle 2. So this back and forth of drawing lines is just going to create this beautiful uniform pattern. It helps if you're playing some music in the background because you tend to move your hands with the rhythm of the music, so it makes it even more easier and fun. So again, remember, starting from the tip of the petal in circle 2 to the center point that we made, or the tiny little marking we made on circle 4, and coming back to the next tip of the petal in circle number 2. So we are going to do the same thing throughout the mandala. So it's kind of a ritual now that we are going to follow. Now the beauty of mandala drawing is that, as I had told you in part number 1, that you don't have to be sure, or you don't have to plan ahead and know how many circles you're going to have or how many sections you're going to have. You can add or erase as many sections as you want as you go. So like you can see here, I want to draw, I felt the need for one more circle between circle number 4 and circle number 3, a tiny little section. So I'm going to draw one more circle. I'm going to measure it on my scale and make my circle. So now I have one extra circle than we had when we started. So now this tiny little circle is helping me make a thin pattern, a little scallop shape between the cones that we made. So I'm going to take the scallop shape from the tip of the cone, of one cone, to the tip of the other cone, and the base of the scallop shape is going to touch the base of the new circle that we made. So you see all these lines and sections that you see on the page are basically your reference points. To these tell you where to start your pattern, where to end it, and where to dip it and where to raise it. So it's basically like a graph paper, or like a guide for you that helps you move your hand and create patterns that will end up looking exactly the same. Now I think you must have got the hang of it, as in how to make the tiny little markings on the center of each section and then make your patterns from there. So I'm going to fast forward it a bit, because or else we will be here all day. So yes, let's fast forward and I'll see you towards the end. Now, one thing to remember is that mandala drawing can be completely and entirely be done using a scale and a rounder, or you could even draw just a section or a slice of the whole circle and then trace it using a tracing paper and then replicate it in rest of the sections. You can use any of these methods, but I like it I like my mandala drawings to be a little organic, as in I like my lines to be a little shaky. I like my curves to be a little uneven. So I find too much perfection in mandala drawing off-putting. So that's the reason I like to mark or make the tiny markings on the paper and draw them by hand, draw the patterns by hand, and not using a scale or a rounder or by measuring every little detail. So it's up to you. You can choose to do it the way you like, but this is how I like it. You can make as many patterns as you want in a mandala. I have chosen very few in here, but I am definitely going to try and make a video on how to make different kinds of patterns that can be used in mandala drawing. What I've done now is I have used a pen and I have carefully drawn over the pencil drawings or the pencil lines that we had, just the pattern, not the extra lines and markings. So I've drawn this with a Micron 005 pen It's a very, very, very fine tip pen. I'll show you in a minute. Here you go. It's a very fine tip pen. The tip of the pen is thinner than any strand of hair I have on my head, seriously. But it's a very thin pen, and I've used it to go over all the designs that I have on paper, just the designs, not the markings or the extra lines that I had. Now the next thing I did is I took an eraser and I erased all the lines and all the pencil markings, the extra pencil markings that I had on paper. So now all we have is a clean design drawn in pen. Now I usually draw with pen at the end of my painting, that is after I've done my painting, but I did this so that it's clearer for you to see. So this brings us to the end of part 2 of how I draw mandalas. Now the next part is going to be about painting the mandalas using watercolors. It's going to be really fun and colorful, so stay tuned and keep watching this space. Till then, bye-bye.